Hello children. We are today going to do the third chapter from the first unit, and this chapter is titled The 10 Plagues on Egypt. I am Mina Mathew and I will be conducting your class for today. In this chapter, children, we are going to learn how God sends 10 plagues on the land of Egypt for the sake of rescuing the Israelites who were being held there as slaves in Egypt. In this chapter, we will learn how God performs miracles to reveal His power and glory in His purpose of delivering us from evil. God always has mercy for His people, and He knows their sufferings and delivers them from their misery. So, God, He understood, He had compassion towards the sufferings and the tortures that the Israelites were undergoing in Egypt, and He delivers them from this misery. And it is for this very reason that He sends the 10 plagues on Egypt. Now, we know that God had sent Moses as His messenger to Pharaoh. Yes, so that he could go and request the Pharaoh to let go of the Israelites. The Lord, He sent Moses and Aaron to the Pharaoh and asked him to allow the Hebrews to go, whom he had been treating as slaves in Egypt. But Pharaoh refused to let the people go and forced them to do hard labor, meaning hard work, without giving them proper wages. He would get the people to do all kinds of hard work beyond their strength, and He would not give them money. He would not give them anything in return. Then Moses came to the palace on God's command to demand the release of his people. So finally, Moses came to the Pharaoh's palace, and he, instead of requesting, now demanded that the Israelites should be released. They should be allowed to go. Moses tried telling Pharaoh why he should not resent God and God's orders. So he performed his first miracles before the Pharaoh, just as directed by God. He threw down his rod before the court, and it became a serpent. Okay, it became a snake. Then Pharaoh's sorcerers, that is Pharaoh's magicians who were there in the court, they also threw down their rods, and their rods also became serpents. But Moses' serpent swallowed the rods of the other sorcerers. But the serpent that Moses had created had more power. And what did it do? It swallowed the other serpents which the magicians of Pharaoh had thrown. But Pharaoh remained unmoved by this miracle, and he still refused to let the people of Israel go. Pharaoh was still adamant. Even after seeing the miracles performed by Moses, he refused to let the Hebrews go out of Israel. But God had taken note of the torture that the Israelites were undergoing in Egypt and was wanting to liberate them. So, seeing the adamancy of the Pharaoh, the Lord sent 10 afflictions on the Egyptians. When the Lord saw that Pharaoh was not going to easily release, then God decided that He would send 10 afflictions, that is 10 plagues, 10 sufferings on the Egyptians. The first plague that happened was the waters of the Nile turning to blood. When Pharaoh refused Moses, he struck the water of the river Nile with his staff, and the water turned to blood. The entire river turned to blood. And similarly, all water bodies in Egypt became blood. The fish died, and the river began to stink. You can imagine how it is, when there is blood all around you, there is this horrible stench that comes along. All over Egypt, all the water bodies had turned to blood. So it was stinking everywhere in Egypt. Then Moses asked Pharaoh to release his people as per the Lord's command. But Pharaoh refused. Okay? Pharaoh refused to let the Hebrews go, even after the first plague, where the water of the river Nile was turned to blood. Then God sent the second plague. Hordes of frogs covered the whole of Egypt. Entire Egypt was covered with frogs. Wherever you could set your eye, you would find frogs everywhere. Inside your houses, outside your homes, everywhere. They could even be in your dinner plates, whatever you wanted. Wherever you could look and you could set your eyes, you would find frogs. So all of Egypt was covered with millions of frogs. Pharaoh pleaded with Moses to take the frogs away, and he promised to let the people go. So when Pharaoh saw what was happening, he felt a little troubled. He requested Moses to take the frogs away, and he promised that he would let the people go. So Moses agreed, and all the frogs died, and they were piled into great heaps. Okay? So as per God's command, the frogs all died, and they were all piled into great heaps. But after that, Pharaoh's heart hardened again, and he refused to let the people go. But Pharaoh, even after the frogs died, he forgot the promise that he had made to Moses, and he once again refused to let the people of Israel go. So then God sent the third plague, and upon God's command, Moses struck the dust on the ground with his rod. And suddenly lice infested the entire nation, all the people of Egypt and even their animals. So wherever the people looked now, just like they had frogs everywhere, now lice infested the entire nation of Egypt. It was there on the people, it was there on their animals, it was everywhere. But yet Pharaoh's heart was hard, and he refused to let go of the Israelites. Then came the fourth plague. Terrible swarms of flies came and covered Pharaoh, his men, the Egyptians, and their homes. The entire Egypt was covered with flies, and we can all imagine how terrible it is when even one fly enters our home, how distracting and how terrible we feel. So you can imagine when there are swarms of flies that are in and around you, how bad the people would have felt, and what it did to their lives. So these flies, they came and they covered Pharaoh, his men, and the Egyptians and their homes. But yet Pharaoh's heart remained unmoved. Even after the fourth plague, he refused to let the people go. And then God sent the fifth plague. But this fifth plague was on the livestock of the Egyptians. A deadly plague affected the animals of Egypt, and all the cattle died. All the cattle, that is the cows, the horses, whatever they had with them as their livestock, all those died because of this deadly plague. But see how God's miracles work. The Israeli flocks were spared, but not one of the cattle that belonged to the Israelites died. All those were living, but the ones that belonged to the Egyptians were dead because of this plague. Yet Pharaoh remained as hard as a rock even after the deadly plague on his cattle. Then Moses sent the sixth plague under God's command. He took ashes from the kiln and he stood before the Pharaoh. He then set it loose into the sky, and when the ashes were spread out in the sky, boils broke out on men and animals alike throughout Egypt. Their entire body was covered with red boils, which were painful and which covered their entire body. So all the people, all the Egyptians were covered with boils and they were suffering a whole lot of pain. So this was the sixth plague where boils and blisters broke out on the Egyptians. Yet Pharaoh remained as hard as ever, and then at God's command Moses brought in the seventh plague. He held out his hand towards the sky. The Lord sent thunder and hail and lightning and ruined the land. Some of the Egyptians were terrified by God's threat of hailstorm, and they brought their cattle and slaves in from their fields. But those who had no regard for the word of Jehovah, Jehovah meaning God, they left them out in the storm. Okay, there were many people who thought that no harm is going to be done, and so they left their cattle and their slaves in the fields, and all those got destroyed. So this was the seventh plague, that of the hailstorms, when entire Egypt there was hail and thunder and lightning, and the entire land was ruined. You can see how hailstorms can destroy your crops. Yes, when they cover, it's like ice covering the entire place. So this was the seventh plague. The eighth plague came again because of the refusal of the Pharaoh, and the eighth plague was that of locusts. Locusts are like grasshoppers. They are green in color, but they destroy crops. And here the plague of locusts came, where a whole swarm of locusts came and they covered the land and ate every bit of vegetation on the land. Locusts are known to destroy crops. They eat up the crops and then nothing grows. So they ate up every bit of vegetation that was growing in the land of Egypt. But yet Pharaoh remained as hard as ever, and this led to the ninth plague. The ninth plague was of darkness. Thick darkness descended on the land of Egypt when Moses lifted his hand at the Lord's command. But again, all the plagues only troubled the Egyptians. None of the Hebrew settlements were covered in darkness. They had light. It was only that the Egyptians were covered in this darkness, thick darkness, which God had sent them. This is again a big miracle, children. When we see how it is possible that there is light in one place and there is darkness in the other, we cannot imagine this happening. But then this was God's miracle. God created light and darkness, and everything was in his control. So here he gave light to the Israelites, but he covered the land of Egypt and all the houses of Egypt in darkness. But in spite of those terrible afflictions, Pharaoh's heart was still hard. So Jehovah sent one more disaster on Pharaoh. Jehovah is the name given to God in the Old Testament. So, Jehovah, he sent one more disaster on Pharaoh. This was the last, and this was the deadliest of all the plagues. All the firstborn in every Egyptian family died. Okay? In the 10th plague, which was the most deadliest, all the firstborn, that is, the eldest in every Egyptian family, died. This dance of death claimed all, from the firstborn child of Pharaoh to the firstborn child of every Egyptian. So there was death even in Pharaoh's palace. His firstborn child died, and the firstborn child in every Egyptian family died. The wail of death, that is, the cry of death, resounded throughout the land. Everywhere in Egypt, one could only hear the cries and wails of people who had lost their firstborn children. Okay, so everywhere in and around Egypt, there was just the cry of death. Even the firstborn of the animals also died. So this was the last plague, and this was why it was called the deadliest of all the plagues. Now children, all this, what we have read about the 10 plagues, can be read in the Bible from the book of Exodus, chapters 7 to 11. They talk about all these plagues in detail, and you could read about all this from the Bible. So we must remember, children, that Moses and Aaron performed all these miracles before the Pharaoh. But it was not Moses and Aaron who had the strength to perform this. They performed this because God gave them the strength and God directed them. So they obeyed God, and that is why all these plagues were brought in. They were just instruments of God. Moses and Aaron were just doing what God commanded them to do. However, Pharaoh's heart remained hard throughout these disasters. He let the people of Israel go only after the 10th affliction. These 10 disasters were the Lord's judgment on the Pharaoh and his deities. Okay, Pharaoh had his own set of false gods. Okay, they would, if you read the Bible, you will see how they worshipped false gods. They would make gods out of metal, out of gold, out of various things, and they would begin worshipping. So this was God's judgment on Pharaoh and his false gods, his deities whom he served. Yet, we need to remember that none of these disasters harmed the people of Israel. No Israelite was harmed in all these plagues that hit Egypt. So the memory verse, children, is from Psalm 136, the 4th line. Praise the Lord, to him who alone does great wonders, for his mercy endures forever. I repeat, praise the Lord, to him who alone does great wonders, for his mercy endures forever. Thank you, children. Hope you enjoyed this chapter.
Subscribe now and press the bell icon. Never miss an update.